Siggi Loch, episode 2, the years before act.
There should have been episode 1.
Yeah, I changed it, for some reason. You were born in a city in Poland. Let me Stolp. How do you say it?
It used to be Stolp.
Yeah.
Now it's Słopks.
Yeah, okay.
In Polish.
In Polish, okay. And we can skip the early childhood years. Let's go to the years that you were playing drums with the band. How did that go? And what kind of music you played?
Well, everything started when a friend of mine, I was 15 years old, living in Hanover.
Yeah.
And he said, there's a jazz concert in town, let's go there.
Yeah.
Man said, yeah, but I had no idea. I'd never really heard jazz consciously. And said, okay, we go. But we had no money. So we had to break in. So we were gate breakers, so to speak.
Yeah.
And got into the auditorium. And there was an artist, a small guy, black, white hair, Sidney Bechet.
Yeah.
And I was turned on to jazz doing 1 hour by this single man.
Yeah.
And so then I started to listen. First of all, I bought me a record the next day, which was only an EP.
Okay.
And it was on the label Blue Note.
Yeah.
And it did cost at the time 7 marks and 50, which is a lot of money.
That's right. Yeah.
Look back at the value of the.
We also in Finland had the mark, the Finnish mark.
So I bought my first record before I had a record player.
Yeah.
So the next thing was how to get a record player.
Yeah.
After I had a record player, I did all possible jobs I could find to make money to buy records. And then after listening to records all the time, and at night, Voice of America, I was listening to, and all the radio programs that we had, I wanted to play this music myself. So I got a drum set.
Yeah.
My father always wanted me to play the accordion, which I had to do.
Okay.
I had to carry this instrument to the teacher once a week. Very heavy. I hated it.
Yeah.
And so I said, okay, no more accordion, drums, revolution.
Yeah.
Another kind of music. And so I found a band called the Red Onions. We had to find places to play. We usually went wherever there was a wedding.
Yeah.
We went and played.
Okay. Yeah.
In front of the houses.
Yeah.
Then we get invited for free drinks.
In the 50s.
So in the 50s. So we did all that. Then I started a jazz club. The New Orleans Club, Hanover.
Oh,
because there was a jazz club in Hanover at the time, but they were it was the time of the beatniks, they all had black pullovers, and and the smoking pot, I'm not pot, but pipe, and it was very intellectual. And I was a traditional jazz fan, and they wouldn't even let me become a member. So I decided to start my own club.
Okay.
We had a club in the basement of the house where we lived. Yeah. And we decorated it. We also used it, of course, as a rehearsal room. Yeah. And once a month, we all got together and we playing the new records that we bought or discussed it all. So it was like it used to be in those days.
That's right. Yeah.
So. But then, of course, I found a friend. The first ever record store in Germany was in Hanover, called Die Schallplatte, and the manager was a jazz musician, a bass player. Yeah, and he let me come to the shop every Saturday. Yeah. I got there at 10 in the morning and occupied one cabin. Yeah. And then I was taking all the new records all day long. I was listening to all the new albums that I couldn't buy because I didn't have the money. So eventually, once a month, I bought 1 or 2, but I was listening to a lot of records. Okay. And at one point he said, you know so much about this music and so on, and you're so enthusiastic, maybe you should work in the record industry. And I said, well, I would love to, but how? Yeah. And he said, and he got me an interview with the with an EMI, was the manager, regional manager of EMI in Hanover, and they offered me a job as a salesman for imported records. So just records that they were not officially released on the label by EMI in Germany.
Yeah.
So I was the first so-called test salesman for imported music.
Yeah.
And so but of course I had to cover all kinds of music, not just jazz.
Yeah.
There was classical, there was pop.
Yeah.
I imported the first album, but Cliff Richard was a big star. Mm-hmm. But of course, in his backing band, they had their very first record. And I felt, okay, I should import that, and had a first hit. And then they took it over and released it officially. So this was like a test for new music.
And you were selling those imported records for the retailers at the record store.
I had a little Volkswagen, only one-seater driver's seat. I went once a month to the head office in Cologne. Yeah. And I loaded my car with full of albums that had arrived in the weeks before, and then I went and sold them out of the car to the stores, and they, and of course they had to find customers. Yeah, and of course I always wanted to also specialize on jazz, so there was jazz, of course. Yeah, and there was also flamenco. Yeah, and I became fan of flamenco music as well. Okay, and so 2 years into this job, there was a situation where I was just about to enter, a store. Yeah, there was a colleague from another label. Yeah, it turned out to be Philips. Yeah. At that time, they had the distribution rights for the Columbia records in all over the world except the United States. Yeah, because the Columbia label in America, the original trademark was owned by EMI. Yes. They had just stealing it after World War II, but they had no legal rights to it. So they could not export the original American records. Yeah. So everything was released outside of the US on Philips, Fontana. Yeah. So I was just about to get into the store, and I said, no, I come later. I said, no, come in, I have a question. So the buyer in the store was talking to this Philips, and there was one, at that point there was already kind of a small jazz success, namely Miles Davis, Gil Evans, Porgy and Bess. Yes, that was a successful jazz album. Yeah, and she said, I have a customer that told me there is already a new album out by Miles Davis and Gil Evans. And he said, no, I would know that. We would know that. Yeah. No, there is no album like that. Yeah, yeah. And I said, the guy was called Bruno. I said, Bruno, I'm sorry, but there is a new album out. Okay. Because I had a subscription to Downbeat as part of my job. Okay. So I was reading, of course, all the new releases, and I knew the albums. Yeah. Sketches of Spain was, I said, the album is out. It was already released last year. Yeah. And it's called Sketches of Spain. Okay. And he was furious. And us all salesmen, myself, we had to write weekly reports to the head office. Yeah. How many customers we have seen, how many records we have sold, how much money we've spent, how many kilometers we have been driving, etc. So this guy wrote to his home office, I had this is terrible, I didn't know about this, and I was put on the spot, and it was very ridiculous, and was bad for my reputation, etc. Yeah. And somebody in the home office, called the guy back and said, who was that guy? Yeah. And out of the blue, I got a letter, an invitation to visit the Philips home office in Hamburg. I lived in Hanover. Mm-hmm. And once a month I was also visiting Hamburg dealers because, my customers. Yeah. And I went to Philips. Yeah. And they interviewed me and said, we are going to, we are losing all of the catalog from Columbia Records. Yeah. Because they start their own international distribution. Yeah. And we have to replace this loss of repertoire. Yeah. And we have decided in the home office in Holland, they think the next big thing in the record business will be jazz.
Yeah.
And of course, Stan Getz just had a #1 hit. It was so bossa nova was the big thing.
Yeah.
And they said, and we understand you have a very good knowledge of jazz.
Yeah.
And we are looking for a label manager and I said, God, just jazz. I mean, nothing but jazz. Don't have to worry about anything else.
Yeah.
And have an office.
Yeah.
And move to Hamburg.
Yeah.
And I said, yes. And then they offered me a deal. Then he asked me, how old are you? And I said, 22.
Yeah.
Oh God, I should not have offered you this kind of, this was not a big deal. It was 450 Deutschmarks.
Yeah.
So, but of course, he forgot to ask me one important question, namely, how good is your English? So they felt the guy speaks about jazz and all the names and everything.
Yeah.
Of course, he speaks English, but in fact, I did not.
Okay.
My English was only fractional.
Okay.
And so I accepted the job, and in first of April 1962.
Yeah.
I moved. I started as a label manager for Philips Jazz.
Tone. Yeah. Philips Tone. Yeah.
So Philips Tone, it was called.
Yeah.
And of course, at that time, still, almost 80% of the record business in Germany was Schlager.
Yeah.
Including a lot of Scandinavian singers.
That's right. The music business really had an appeal for you. It looks like that. I remember one time you told me a story involving Frank Zappa and accordion.
Yeah, but that came much later.
I know, but we have to get this story. So, for some reason, you were on tour with Frank Zappa, right?
Zappa came to Hamburg. Yes.
Yeah.
And I had been to Zappa's house.
Yeah.
in Los Angeles a few times.
Okay.
And we talked about music, and all of a sudden he was always interested to find orchestras to perform his music outside of Frank Zappa's band.
That's
he was
right.
A fantastic composer. And,
yes.
And of course he asked me, can you be of any help? I said, well, your music is rhythmically so complicated. I think only the Strasbourg ensemble modern can play your music. And he said, you know that orchestra? He said, yes, I do.
Yeah.
You should not be in the music business with a knowledge like that. And somehow he asked me, what I did before, and so I told him that my father made me play the accordion.
Yeah. Okay.
Now he comes to Hamburg, plays, big auditorium, CCH, 2,500 people in the hall. In those days, you still could step from the door. I mean, there was no security and no, like today.
Yeah.
So you could actually step on stage from the auditorium.
Yeah.
Anyway, he was playing, and then at one point he said, thank you, Siggi, for taking care of my music.
Yeah.
This was already at Warner's.
Yeah.
And but I understand you play the accordion, right? I said, now come on. And I was sitting first row. And never again after that was sitting first row in any of the concerts of my artists.
Yeah.
Anyway, so he said, come on over. And then somebody from behind brought an accordion to him.
Yeah.
He said, come on and play. And I said, no. And then the bodyguards, the bunk, they took me both, and actually, I was on stage standing next to Zappa, and I said, Zappa, I can't play the accordion. Then he said, well, you're selling all my records. You know my music inside out, right? So you should know the lyrics of my songs, don't you?
Yeah. This is in front of the audience. Yeah.
So he put me on a second time, because I did not.
Wow.
Anyway, then I was back on my seat, and it was terrible. Absolutely terrible.
Well, that was the kind of guy he was, Yeah. But you got along with him very well.
Oh yes, of course. Even then, I went backstage after the show.
Yeah.
He was smiling, said, Siggi, I couldn't stop the temptation to put you on.
Well, it says here on my notes, year 64, wedding with Siggi Loch. That must have been a good moment for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Such a long time ago. And
yes, we actually met the same year, in 1955.
Yeah.
The year I heard Sidney Bechet was in May.
Yeah.
And in December of the same year, I met Sissy for the first time at a Christmas party.
Is Siggi somebody that when you have to make a decision in your working life that you can ball around with her and get a feedback? Should I do this, or are you no?
Frankly, not.
Okay.
I needed Sissy in all the things that I've done. It was a very hectic life, moved a lot of time around. I never stayed in one place longer than a couple of years, then moved on to the next city. Sometimes I moved back, like I lived in Munich twice in my life, and I lived in Hamburg 3 times in my life.
And London,
never longer than, the longest was 10 years.
Yeah.
And so we moved a lot around, and but she was so important to me as the constant thing.
Yeah,
I always couldn't come back home, and there was home.
Yeah,
and she was there.
Yeah,
but she was never involved in any of my business decisions.
That's probably the secret of of your long relationship. Before we go to the story how you got your job with Liberty, let's talk about the art hobby a little bit. I mean, this is you have the ear for the music, but you also have the eye for the art. So how did that start? Once you told me a story about young artists exhibition in Munich that you spotted the Richter. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I think the first, the initiative to this was when I was the label manager for Philips.
Yeah.
One part of my job was the relationship with a magazine at the time was called Twen.
Yeah.
The first cult magazine in the country.
Yeah.
Once a month, very, fantastic, big size.
Yeah.
Great photography.
Yeah.
And stories about literature, art, music, etc. But there was always every month one record that they promoted in the magazine and was released on the Philips label. It was called the Philips Twen series.
Yeah.
So I had to communicate with the head office of the magazine every month. Actually, it was in Cologne.
Yeah.
To discuss the new next coming album.
Yeah.
And it was usually always repertoire from the catalog.
Yeah.
We never produced something special for the label, except when I had made my first recording with Klaus Doldinger. Doldinger just made in Germany. My boss was not so crazy about it, but we talked about this in a little bit because it's an important part of my story. So they said, and they always created the cover.
Yeah.
And for this album, the first album that was actually produced for Philips Twen, this Doldinger album, they choose was an artwork. At the time, the art was called op art. Contrary to pop art from America, this was a European movement out of Switzerland, op art.
Yeah.
It was, of course, abstract. And when I talked, and they said, you should never put an artist's face on a cover because it's boring. You should always try to find a different thing to interest the eye and the consumer, but something that attracts his eyes had actually nothing to do with the music itself. Okay. It's just, to create a second level of interest for the object, which of course at
and
the
start
time
the imagination
was a an album cover.
Yeah.
So they created, and I learned from that first session, from that first experience. It sticked in my mind that when I ever start my own label, this is going to be the philosophy. So in fact, years later, I was running Liberty Records in Munich. I had my first nice bonus check. And we went to an art exhibition, annual art of artists that could not find a gallery. Like that. We have thousands of pieces there. Most of it uninteresting. But anyway, we went. And before I was collecting, prints and things. I mean, stuff that I could afford. Things I liked. But and of course I was I was still doing a lot of photography, so my eyes was trained also by doing photographs. Anyway, when we went to this exhibition, we saw Sissy and myself both at the same moment. We felt this is a fantastic painting, and we asked who is the artist, and they said the artist's name is Gerhard Richter. And this was 1970. And the painting was already 2 years old by then. It was painted in 1968, just about 2 years after he actually came from then East Germany, DDR, to West Germany, and was living in Düsseldorf and working. Basically, it was what they call it. He was taking photographs, and he was making photographs, turning into paintings,
like Lake of Lucerne,
changing.
Anyway,
so we loved this painting, and Sissy, we said, well, how much is it? They said 20,000 Deutschmark, which was by far the most expensive piece in the whole exhibition. It's a lot of money. But we still said, we love it so much. And I had my bonus check just gotten from Liberty. I said, we turned the bonus into a painting and bought our very first painting. This was 1970. So, as it happened, Gerhard Richter became the most expensive artist in modern painting.
That's right.
From Germany, and also on a worldwide level. So, I think... And this happened a few times after. So I think, my talent to find talent is not just about music. It is also about art. Because I found quite a number of artists that became big afterwards. Last example was Stanley Whitney. Totally unknown. Now he is a big star. His work he has not been signed, but the biggest art gallery in the world, Gasconian, and his pictures now go for $1.5 million or 2 million, and I bought this for 30,000 euros. So, and of course, and it also goes for management talent. I found a lot of very, very, very good management talent during my years in the business. One of them, of course, is my closest friend, is Michael Hantjes. Very, very, very important entrepreneur. Very rich man. I mean, 10 times richer than I could even think of. And he remains my closest friend. But he started as my assistant. And the other guy, the first guy I hired as a label manager for ACT was a man called David Zwirner, a name of an art dealer, a drummer, who didn't want to become a musician. And the father called me, having getting a job. I said, you can get a job at my company. I'm just starting one. And he came and he worked for me a year and a half. Then he said, my father stopped his gallery. I go back to New York and start my gallery.
That's right.
David Zwirner is the second most successful art dealer in the world today. So he had only, in his whole life, he had only one boss ever.
That was you. And there's something about the drummers on ACT label, because you're a drummer, this David was a drummer, Marko Ostrovsky drummer, Andreas Brandis a drummer, Michael Gottfried, all drummers.
That's correct.
that is astonishing. And later than that, year 70, you have had other Gerhard Richter paintings, of course.
Yes. But the first one I sold in order to get this house, which is big enough to house my collection.
Yeah, and your concerts.
I could only, in my concerts, I could only afford it by selling that painting.
Yeah, that's right.
So I bought it for 20,000 Deutschmark, and I sold it for 3.7 million euro.
And it's called,
instead, got the house I'm living in.
Yeah. And I believe the painting is called Lake of Lucerne, right?
It's Vierwaldstätter See.
Yeah, that's the one. Okay, let's go to the Liberty Records. At age of 26, you got the job. How did you get the job?
Well, I'm sorry, but I have to start with Klaus Doldinger.
Okay, yeah.
Because when I got this job as label manager, I also said to my then boss, but would there be a chance for me to also go into the studio and record myself?
Yeah.
And he said, well, yeah, but we'll see, because I had this, Blue Note story in mind. And the idea was to eventually have my own jazz label.
Yeah.
So, and it was only a few months after I came to the company when I went to the jazz festival in Düsseldorf, and there was Klaus Doldinger on stage, whom I had seen before as a traditional musician, because he was a clarinet player and a feet warmer, traditional years before.
Yeah.
He turned on to a modern jazz musician playing tenor saxophone.
Yeah.
And he had this Klaus Doldinger's quartet.
Yeah.
And that performance just knocked me off. Just like Sidney Bechet did, right?
Yeah.
8 years before.
Yeah.
But now it's modern jazz. And I felt the guy is amazing. And I went backstage and said, Mr. Doldinger, my name is Siggi Loch. I just became the Philips for Jazz manager.
Yeah.
And we should make records together.
Yeah.
And he said, well, yeah, sure.
Okay.
And I went back to my boss and told him about all this. Said, we're trying to build a jazz catalog.
Yeah.
So shouldn't we also try to have some local jazz, right?
Yeah.
To make it... then, of course, then it's the story that I said, think about, Stan Getz had #1 hit in America right now.
Yeah.
And he said, okay, give it a chance, but you have to record Bossa Nova.
Okay.
Which I did.
Yeah.
And of course, then when the record was made, he liked it that much. And the trend people, I went to the trend people and said in the magazine, wouldn't it be nice to have Doldinger on trend? Because he is a trend.
Yeah.
He is 25.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay? And they called my boss and said, we would like to have an album in the series by Klaus Doldinger.
Yeah.
So then the boss called me in and said, well, I mean, you have done this Bossa Nova, but I think it's time to make an album for the trend people.
Yeah.
So that's how I got the job to record the first album, which I then called Klaus Doldinger Jazz Made in Germany.
Yeah.
And it was the beginning, was the first album Doldinger ever recorded under his own name.
Yes.
And it was my job as a producer. And it became a landmark in the lives of at least two people, namely Doldinger and myself.
Yes.
So all of that happened. I recorded a lot more, and but then of course I just fell out because the boss who hired me, he was sent to Mexico.
Yeah.
And there was a new guy to become my boss at Philips.
Yeah.
And I didn't like the man, and I think he disliked me as much as I didn't like him.
Okay.
And I felt this is the end of my job here. And I said, okay, now is the time to start my own label.
Yeah.
And I decided to go to Munich.
Yeah.
And start the label.
Yeah.
That was it.
Yeah.
At the same time, of course, I had also become known as the producer of all of the Star Club recordings. So including Spencer Davis Group, the Rattles. I recorded the first album by a group called the Searchers.
Yeah.
It was the second Liverpool band with a #1 hit. And I had recorded that tune as they were in Hamburg, Suites for My Suite.
Okay.
So all of a sudden, I became a name in the industry, not so much for my jazz activities, but for the Star Club stuff.
Yeah.
And somehow the story was known across the street in America, across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
And as I decided to go to Munich, I got an offer, or I got a call from somebody I didn't know. He turned out to be the president and the owner of Liberty Records. And he invited me to come to Los Angeles.
Yes.
It's my very first visit to
LA.
To America.
Yeah, okay.
And so I was there, and then he said, I really, he was a very hot independent label at the time.
Yeah.
And he wanted to expand to Europe. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to start, a business in Europe.
Yeah.
And he said, would you be interested? And mind you, I was 25 at that point. So, mind you, can you start working for me as a producer?
Yeah.
So you can produce European rock music in addition to our American catalog.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, well, but you see, I know, of course, I've done all the Star Club recordings, but I want to start a jazz label. Well, this is really the music closest to my heart.
Yeah.
And he said, jazz? Yes. He said, do you know Blue Note? And I said, yeah, of course. That's why I want to do it.
Yeah.
The story of Blue Note is supposed to be, the blueprint of what I want to do with my own label called Act, because I had the name already in my mind.
All right, okay.
And he said, Chaz, you know what? Blue Note, I just bought it. So I said, what? I said, yes, I just bought Blue Note. So if you work for me, you would work for Blue Note indirectly.
Wow. Okay.
And why don't you change your return flight and go through New York and meet the Blue Note guys?
Okay. Yeah.
And I did.
Yeah.
And I actually went to New York and I went Francis Wolff and Alfred Lyon. I met the guys.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, that turned me on to accept the job as a freelance producer at first for Liberty Records. Went back to Europe, and he asked me to shop around the idea of, a distribution company for the for the Liberty Records.
Yeah.
So I did the tour of the German record companies.
Yeah.
Nobody was interested in the deal proposal.
Yeah.
So then Al Bennet came to Europe to visit me in Munich.
Yeah.
And he was a big gambler. He was a big gambler.
Yeah.
And wherever he went, he spent the night before. He spent the nights in a gambling place.
Yeah.
And in London, there was the Curzon House. That was like the number one casino in London. Still, I don't know.
Yeah.
And he came to Munich with two of his buddies, and they picked them up at the airport. They stayed at the presidential suite at the Four Seasons, at Bayerischer Hof, I'm sorry. And so then he said, okay, Sig, because he could never say Siegfried or Ziggy even. Hey, Sig, because he was a Southerner coming from Jena, Arkansas.
Yeah.
So, and I said, I'm sorry, I went around and nobody is interested in your proposal. And then they had these newspapers under their arm as I picked them up, as they came out of the plane and went through customs.
Yeah.
And then he said, and he opened the papers, and on the table were all this British money. And then in the end, it was exactly £1 million. That's at the point when they closed, the crap table the night before.
At the casino. Yeah.
He cashed, and illegally they brought this money into Germany. Mm-hmm. So the guy said to me, Siggy, what? Sig?
Yeah.
I want to have my own record company in Germany, and you're going to run it. And this is the money. That's all you're going to get. Get it off the ground and make it happen. I was just about turning 26 at that point.
Yeah.
And I said, wow, of course I have to forget my own label.
Yeah.
But then I talked to a number of friends and they said, Siggy, do you know what he said? What qualifies you to start a record company at your age?
Yeah.
All you have to offer, all you have on the table is a couple of jazz records, a couple of rock and roll records, and that's it.
Yeah.
You have no business training of anything.
Yeah.
You have never seen a university from inside. But I accepted the job.
Of course.
And I made Liberty successful.
Yeah.
Of course, I knew I can't do it with jazz. Yes, I signed Klaus Doldinger, of course. And I also made sure that his records would be now released in America on World Pacific Jazz, because that was part of the company. Yeah. And of course, I was distributing Blue Note records in Germany. But I had to find music that was fit the German market.
Yeah.
So I was looking for a singer who could... I said, don't want to do Schlager, but I want to do music sung in German, but on like chansons in France.
Yeah.
So I was looking for artists. The first one I found was a young singer in Berlin. She actually approached me.
Yeah.
She heard about, my story.
Yeah.
And because when I opened the company, there was big stories on a lot of German newspapers. They said, I've never said that, but journalists, because I was so young, the youngest guy in the business worldwide, so to speak, in that position.
Yeah.
And then they said, I never said it, but they said, ich schlage die Schnulze K.O. The story was the youngest guy with age of 26 is starting a record company and is against the German trend of Schlager music, which in essence was right. Anyway, this girl in Berlin approached me, sent me a demo tape, and I liked it, and I met her in Berlin, and her name was Katja Witkewitsch, and I said, with Katja Witkewitsch, forget it, you can never become a star, change your name. And she was living in Epsteinstraße. I said, why not Katja Epstein? And of course, there was the famous Beatles manager by the same name.
Yeah.
And she said, okay. And so she became Katja Epstein, and she became a star. She is still a star after all these years.
All these years,
And of course, I also signed Amandul, I signed Can, and like some of the really important new rock bands that came out of Germany.
Yeah.
So this was, and of course, at the end of, then of course, was all Al Bennet, because nobody in the world would have ever given a 26-year-old German the chance to start a record company.
Yeah.
But of course, the company was sold then, 3 years after, to Transamerica. And Transamerica had also bought United Artists.
Yeah.
So they fused United Artists with Liberty.
Yeah.
Bennett became the biggest shareholder of Transamerica.
Yeah.
And one night he called me up and said, "Hey, Sig, we are in a board meeting in Palm Springs. They kicked my ass out of here. But so don't worry, you're okay. They need you. Don't worry. And I'm still the biggest shareholder, so you have my backing.
Yeah.
So don't panic.
Don't panic, yeah.
But I knew the moment I have to deal with real businessmen.
Yeah.
Not people like Al Bennet. He was a great businessman.
Yeah.
But he was a street man,
Yeah.
Man, he came out of the streets.
Yes.
And I said, this is not going to work. So I resigned.
Yeah, okay.
When I heard that Bennett was kicked, I resigned from the label.
Okay.
And they tried very hard to make me stay. I said, no. I now start my label that I wanted to do in the first place.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to start ACT.
Yeah.
It's my own record label.
Yeah.
Here comes another, this one, it was, a telegram.
Yeah.
Call Burbank Collect.
Yeah.
Burbank. I didn't even know where Burbank was.
Yeah.
And Phil Rose. I never heard the name before. And so I called.
Yeah.
And there was, Warner Brothers Records. Warner Brothers Records. I talked to Phil Rose. And the guy said, "Hey, Siggy, what do you think what happened across the street?" So he had already heard that Al Bennet was kicked out of Liberty United Artists Records.
Yeah.
And they somehow had me on the monitor. And he said, Nezri Erdogan, whom you know, because he said that he had met you before.
Yeah.
You said, yes, I met him. He's one of my biggest idols as a producer.
Yeah.
He's coming to Europe in 2 weeks, and he would like to meet you. Would you be ready to see him in Milano? Well, why not? I mean, Nezri Erdogan, my hero. Yes, of course, I go to Milano. So or had already been planning to set up my label. Doldinger was supposed to be coming with me on my own label.
Yeah.
And so, but I went to Milano and meet Nancy Oettinger in a hotel.
Yeah.
He was there sitting with the vice president of then Kinney, which became Warner Communications.
Yeah.
And he told me the story that they have bought these 3 labels, Atlantic, Warner, Elektra, combining the 3 in the dream of Steve Ross, the founder of Warner, Kinney and Warner Communications, wanted to become the biggest record company in the world.
Yeah.
So this is why he bought these 3 record companies, and they want to also start at the same time an international organization. And Nancy Oettinger, Turk, son of a diplomat, was an international, well-established, traveler, became the president of this newly formed operation. It wasn't called WEA then, but Kinney International.
Yeah.
And then he said, Siggi, I need you. Because we want to build a real empire. And I said, but Nezri, I want to start my label. I mean, it's the second time now, and it's about time to do it. He said, then he said, Siggi, I know jazz at least as much as you do. And I guarantee you, whatever we will do, there will always be jazz. But there is no money in jazz. So we can do bigger things. Trust me. And eventually, I accepted that night the job to become the founding managing director of what was then called in the beginning Warner Music Germany.
Yes.
And I went back. When the wife of the vice president of Kinney was with them, at the midnight they called the reception in the hotel for a typewriter.
Yeah.
And then the wife of the vice president of Kinney typed the letter of intent, which became later my employment agreement. At that night to sign it, because they said the offer is only now or not.
Okay.
So anyway, I signed to become, the head of the German company first. And so I went back to Sissy and said, Sissy, I'm sorry, I have to stall my idea of my own jazz label once again.
Whoops, something came off.
I become the founding manager. But of course, once we should not forget, without Al Bennet, right, who had a trust in me, who trusted in this young guy.
And his gambling habit.
And his gambling habits. He put me really in business.
That's right.
Without Al Bennet, nothing of what happened in my life thereafter would have ever happened.
When was your last encounter with Al Bennet?
That was tragic, because his youngest son had committed suicide after at Christmas Eve. After he was, they told him that he had cancer at the age of 26.
Okay.
And he was down and out. And I think he never really came over that.
Okay.
So that was the last time when I saw him, and he was a broken man.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry to hear.
Yes.
Genelec, leader in professional audio solutions, is proud to partner with Algorytmi Podcast. At Genelec, we blend art with science and engineering to deliver exceptional audio solutions that improve every listening experience. We're proud to support discussions that explore the fascinating world of music and beyond. And also ACT is using Genelec in the recordings in the studio. Okay, so that deal made with the typewriter, from the hotel reception in Milano, that led you to London, to live in London, right?
Well, no.
No?
I was supposed to start a company in Munich.
Yeah.
And that was the first idea. But then it turned out that Hamburg was still the city of the music industry in Germany.
Yeah.
And Nancy Oettinger felt that we should really have the company based in Hamburg, where all the music industry activities were happening.
Yeah.
Munich was not. Munich was a wonderful city. They call it the secret capital of Germany. But no.
Yeah.
So I had to move back to Hamburg.
Yeah.
And we started Hamburg. We started first Kinney because we couldn't use Warner because, Ahmed Ertegun, head of Atlantic Records, was totally against it. He said, hey, in Europe, my label is much more successful than Warner Records, the movie, but the record company, no, we are the biggest. And Elektra was also.
Yeah.
And he said we should call it Atlantic. Of course, when Warner said, no, you can't call it Atlantic. So the compromise was that they bought these 3 labels. They would call it VIA, the Warner Elektra Atlantic.
Okay.
So this is how it became VIA rather than
Yeah. All right.
So anyway, we started the company, and of course, Al Bennett became my mentor, or like my fatherly friend.
Yeah.
And we from that moment onwards, I had a fantastic relationship with this man.
Yeah.
And not only was he a great jazz admirer and producer, but he had so much interest in art, like myself. He had a huge collection of surrealistic art.
Yeah.
He was a man in sports. He was a soccer fanatic.
Yeah.
Living in New York, he was still getting all of the important weekly soccer magazines around the world, from Kicker from Germany,
Europe, Bundesliga,
and he went to all international games, etc. Of course, and he and Ahmed, his brother, and some other friends had already started, Cosmos New York as a private little soccer thing, but it was nothing. Nobody in America was interested in soccer.
Yeah.
So, but he used this influence to have Steve Ross, the chairman of Warner, to invest in the idea of making soccer popular in America.
Yeah.
Because they said, listen, the biggest sport in the world is soccer.
Yeah.
So the only, in America, nothing. So we could change that. And they tried.
Yeah.
And of course, you need names. So he was first instrumental. And he was able to persuade Pelé to come to play at New York, at Cosmos New York.
Yeah.
When Pelé's career came to an end 3 years later, he had to replace, and of course the second worldwide known soccer player was Franz Beckenbauer.
That's right.
So this is when Nessie Ertegun called me up and said, Siggi, you need an appointment with Beckenbauer and his manager. You have to organize that. And I said, but Nessie, I have no connection whatsoever to the soccer world. I'm not even a real soccer fan myself.
Yeah.
I said, Siggi, I don't care, but it's really important. So please.
Yeah.
So I had to organize a meeting with Nessie Ertegun, Franz Beckenbauer, and the manager in Bavaria, and I managed.
Yeah.
And he came. They met, and the rest is history. He persuaded Franz Beckenbauer to leave Bayern München. He was the captain of that team he started as a kid playing for Bayern München. Yeah. And he was the captain of the national team. Yeah. He was a world, So anyway, he was world champion in 74.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, so he managed to bring Franz Beckenbauer to New York as a captain of the Cosmos.
Yeah.
So it's another little episode.
That's another little episode. Couple words about these brothers, because they keep popping out, Ahmed and Nesuhi. So if anybody goes to Wikipedia, they did incredible favors for the world of music, especially Ahmed, who signed so many new artists. But maybe could you just tell what kind of guys they were? What is your memory of them both? You were closer to Nesuhi, of course.
Yeah. The story was that you could only be a friend of one of the two.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes, they were really different in characters.
Okay.
Really. As brothers, you could not divide them. When anything happened, that then they were glued together.
Yes.
But other than that,
Yeah.
they were completely separate and had totally different interests. Music, yes, but different kind of music.
Yeah.
Anyway, the story is that Nezri was the older brother that loved jazz.
Yeah.
The father was the Turkish ambassador to the United States before and during the war, World War II. Before he was ambassador in Switzerland.
Yeah.
The boys went to school in Switzerland, so they both spoke pretty good German.
Yeah.
And later he was ambassador in Paris. Then they went to university, Sorbonne. So they were very well educated people from a very, very well educated and famous Turkish family. Everybody in Turkey, even today, knows the name Ertegun.
Yeah.
So it's it's household name in Turkey. So the father was the ambassador for Turkey to America, and the kids were into jazz. So Nezri took his brother to New York, checking the heydays of swing first, and then of course the beginning of bebop.
Yeah.
They were there, they saw it all, and they organized concerts in the Turkish embassy in Washington, bringing black and white musicians on stage, which was, it was the sensational Concert 39 of Carnegie Hall, but before they were segregation, And anyway, so they were really heavily into music. And after the war, Dejuhi moved to California, and he started a record store.
Yeah.
And started producing records. He also had a little label, Crescent Records, and he became the first lecturer of jazz at any American university, a Turk. Amazing.
Yeah.
But the brother was, he liked jazz too, but he was really much more into this new called race music. So black music that was on so-called race labels, race music. And he's had the idea, because he loved that music so much, he said, I have to make this music popular to a white audience.
Yeah.
So that was his vision.
Yeah.
And he had another friend at the time in Washington, and they had this idea. His name was Abramson, and they had no money. They had this great education, but they're not necessarily rich.
Yeah.
And his father wouldn't give him the money, so he got the money to start. His first recording was a loan from his dentist. So that was the first recording of Ahmed, and he formed Atlantic Records.
Yes.
Later, I had the chance to ask him, so how come why did you choose Atlantic as a label? He said, I wanted to make sure, independent labels, you have to sell and get money.
Yeah.
So you have to make sure to get paid. And I wanted to make sure in the alphabet that I have my label's name is first in the alphabet. So Atlantic just came to mind because they are cross-Atlantic people from across the Atlantic.
That's right.
Turkey.
Yeah.
So this is how they choose. He chose Atlantic.
Yeah.
Anyway, he started recording black artists. For a white audience, and of course, then he discovered and endless the Drifters and Clyde McFeathers and Otis Redding, and of course then Aretha Franklin before Ray Charles, then Otis Redding, and and of course Aretha Franklin, and so on and on. So, but he moved to New York, so he had this, and it became really a successful record label.
Yes.
While Nezri was still in California, running his record store, and producing records for other labels, especially for Lester Koenig, who had Contemporary Jazz, another important indie label from the West Coast from that time.
Yeah.
And he was the one he made the first recording with Ornette Coleman, for instance, for Contemporary Jazz.
Yeah.
But then he got an offer to become a staff producer for Verve.
Yes.
Verve was already an established jazz label.
Yeah, later with Universal.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he told his brother that he would move to New York, become a staff producer for Verve. And the brother said, no way, you're not going to work for the competition. And that was a real competition. Before Christian and Lester Koenig, he couldn't care less.
Yeah.
But now, it's a real competitor.
Yeah.
His brother to work, no. He said, you have to come and, and start and work for Atlantic.
Yeah.
But he said, but I mean, this is not my music. And I said, listen, so you start jazz. You start a jazz line for Atlantic.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And number two, this was just the beginning when albums came into play.
Yeah.
1955 was the beginning of 12-inch vinyl albums.
That's right.
And you will become in charge of the building of a vinyl, of an LP catalog for Atlantic.
Yeah.
And you will take care of the international markets because you speak 5 languages. You have spent most of your time in Europe and you're traveling all the time.
Yeah.
So this is going to be your part in it, and you become a partner.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So, and Nesri accepted the job, moved to New York, and became a partner of Ahmed in Atlantic Records. And then he became the great producer of jazz, and of course the international ambassador for music, and
That's
especially
right.
Atlantic. That he became.
And they got along. They were not fighting.
But of course, Nesri was very much into surrealistic art.
Yeah.
Ahmed later got very much into pop art. So he was, as Nesri had his surrealistic collection, one of the best in the world.
Yeah.
And of course, Ahmed became a big collector of pop art. I mean, of course, Warhol and etc.
Yeah. Once you told me a story that you were present in the room where they showed the first ever CD. This is a big jump in years, but where was it? The world's first CD.
Yeah, well, this was still at my Warner at the time.
Yeah.
Because in the late 70s there was a shortage on vinyl.
Yeah.
Because of the first oil
crisis. Yeah.
And I was then in charge of more than just Germany.
Yeah.
And I said to the guys, we have to, they owned a big building complex nearby Aachen in the middle of nowhere. And they wanted me to sell it. It was impossible. I said, we can make use of it. Why not starting a pressing plant? So we become independent, because we have to beg for pressings at all the big competitors, Deutsche Grammophon, etc. And I said, why don't we turn it into a factory? And then I made a proposal, and then I had a big meeting, and then the head of the corporation, Steve Ross, came into the building and said, well, that we are not involved in any industrial complex. We own software.
Yeah.
We are not manufacturing.
Yeah.
But of course, he also saw the problem getting vinyl pressed. In America, no, he was big enough, but we were not at the same leverage than they were in the United States.
Yeah.
And he said, how much is it? I said, well, our proposal, it's going to cost $4.5 million to build a factory in that complex that we already owned.
Yeah.
And he said, well, $4.5 million, that's less than a movie. Do you believe in it? I said, yes, we do believe in it. Go ahead.
Okay.
So I was the first one to start a pressing plant in the Warner Group. Later, they also already started pressing in America.
Yeah.
But we had the first pressing plant as part of Warner.
Yeah.
And I also always told Nesri, Nesri, he liked the idea of having everybody reporting directly to him. So even the Austrian guy reported to America, Germany, England, France, but also some small companies, Sweden, Denmark, all. And I said, Nesri, this Europe is becoming one big marketplace. And we have to be equipped for that. So I think you have to put all of the energy together, and we should see Europe as one marketplace.
Yeah.
You didn't want to know about it. Then, after 10 years, I was the most successful Warner company outside of the United States and Canada, by far.
Yeah.
Bigger than France, bigger than England, and I had 30% of my turnover was based on German recordings.
That's good.
Which was very, very high percentage.
Yeah.
Today it's different, but in those days it was unheard of.
Yeah.
And I had artists, we had the biggest stars like Marius Müller-Westernhagen. They're still big stars.
Yeah.
Marius is just starting his 75th university tour. Anyway, so we were a very, very successful company.
Yeah.
And I said, this is it. And I start my label.
Yeah.
Finally, that's it. Then they called me into New York and said, you know what, Siggi, you have done well. Now we will take your idea of combining all of the European companies into one new unit and call it Via International.
Yeah.
And you're going to be the president. And you're going to be located in London. First in New York, they said, but it became London later. So this is, and I said, okay. And they offered me a lot of money. And I felt, well, I mean, maybe you have to wait a few more years, but, this is really, really big money. Okay. So I said, okay, I accept it.
And London is a nice town.
And I moved. At first, I was really happy to move to New York. As it turned out, it became London.
Yeah.
And I was living in London. I became head of Europe, Via International. And
but going back and forth.
Yeah. But then in those days, I was every month, at least once, I flew with Concorde from London to New York in the morning.
Yeah.
Had a meeting. I was there before I started.
Of course, yeah.
And I left at 11 in the morning, and I was in New York at 10. And I was in the office all day, and in the night, I took the night flight back to London. Next morning, I was back at my office in London. Yeah. So these were really, really crazy years. But of course, I was, a rather important person in the international music industry. Yeah. So here comes the problem. At that point, the record industry had a real problem with the tape, with taping. Yeah. Because blank tapes. First of all, more than 50% of the music business now was no longer vinyl. Yeah. It was music cassettes. Yeah. Pre-recorded music cassettes. Yeah. And of course, people bought cassettes blank. Yeah. And they copied the music, and the music business really had a big dip, and they had all these campaigns, copying kills the music, and all of that.
Yeah, home taping is killing music.
Is killing the music business, etc. But of course, the business declined. Every year it declined further and further. Yeah. And then, of course, at the meeting in New York, the chairman came in and said, we have this idea with Europe, that's okay, but we think we have to think about merging to be able to stay in the business in the future. So they were talking to Polygram, merging the two organizations. Yeah. And the head of Polygram, Jan Timmer was his name, he had the job when they developed this compact disc. Yeah. Together with the head, of Sony. Yeah. And his name was Morito. And Morito was a classical trained piano player and conductor. Yeah. You don't have those guys anymore, heads of international corporations.
Now.
So when they started to develop the CD, Morito said two things important. The CD must have a a storage space big enough for Beethoven's Ninth Symphony.
We need that.
Which is 72 minutes.
It is, yeah.
Number one.
Yeah.
And second objective, it has to be small enough to get into the pocket of people.
Okay. That's fair.
This is what this is. And so then they invented the CD as we know it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the problem was then Timmer came to a meeting of the international corporation, which was called the IFPI, International Federation of Phonographic Industries.
Yeah.
I was a member. I was the head of the German association.
Yeah.
And the meeting took place in Amsterdam. In Copenhagen. And so here comes Jan Timmer, made the presentation and said, gentlemen, we have all these problems, all of us, because Philips also owned Polygram, huge company, and the biggest outside of the US. And they said, we have the answer to the problem of home taping, because we invented this new technology, which will enable people not to copy the music.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a new business altogether.
Yeah.
Of course, all of the pressing plants around the world will become obsolete.
Yeah.
And it's a complete new business.
Yeah.
And also, if we succeed, we can resell all of the music people had bought on. So
the back catalog.
He made this big presentation, and everybody said, "Wow!" And of course, technically, the dynamic of a CD is endless.
Yeah.
Of course, on every there is always a limit in any vinyl. Dynamics. And so on. So technically, and I said, well, it sounds great, but of course, what happens one day when people will start copying CDs? And he said, and he knew this was what we call Achillesferse, of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And he said, this is a typical German comment. They think technically everything is possible. Theoretically, yes, but practically not. Because it's such a complex technology, we will not see it in our lifetime that we will be able to manufacture machines to copy the CD at home.
How long?
He persuaded the industry. They all went CD.
Yeah.
Right. We even started for Warner a CD plant in Alsdorf.
Yeah.
And of course, the CD became a huge success.
Of course.
And it's the reason for the biggest, because the record industry, because of CD, became really a major industry.
Yeah.
And of course, we saw the decline. Because the moment when the internet started, when people didn't know, nobody needed CDs anymore. Of course, you could copy the CDs as easily as you could copy before the cassette. Same shit happened again. But of course, then came the internet, and then came downloading, and the whole problem started all over again.
That's right.
But his promise that the CD would be the savior, yes, it was. For a while. But it lasted not even a decade.
A very short period of time of the heydays of CDs. But it still goes on in Germany. The Germans love their CDs, and that
the last island.
Yeah, the last island. 3 closing questions. Has the world become a better or worse place during your lifetime?
Come on, I was born in 1940 during the World War. I saw, the war.
The World War.
The World War. And I saw the country completely destroyed.
Yeah.
And I lived the time when Germany came out of how do you call it? Catastrophe. The greatest catastrophe in mankind, happened. And of course, I lived through it, and jazz helped me a lot, because we became a democracy. They saved Germany.
Yeah.
The three allies.
Yeah.
And it's becoming almost electric. 80 years, that we're freed.
Yeah.
From Nazi regime.
Yeah.
And of course, for me, jazz is kind of the blueprint of the idea of democracy, like the individual. The freedom of the individual in a group of equals.
Yeah.
That's jazz for me.
That's right.
Real jazz.
Yeah.
And that is what democracy is all about.
Yeah.
We have seen, the rise of the world based on our freedom concept, based on the idea of democracy.
That's right. In most of the places.
In most of the world. Certainly in the west part of the world.
Yeah.
We have, all what we have today, what we are today, is based on that.
Yeah.
So yes, the world became a much better place since during my lifetime.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, of course, there are really big clouds on the horizon these days, because it seems like it during the Hitler regime. Hitler was elected by the Germans. He didn't came from Mars, and yet we have seen what can happen. Now we see what happened in Russia.
Yeah.
There are parallels. And I hope that it will not end in a catastrophe as the Nazi regime.
That's right.
Turned the world into complete chaos.
Yeah.
Killing millions of people, innocent people.
Yes. What really pisses you off nowadays? What makes you really angry?
What makes me really angry is that, just based on what I just said, and what I experienced during my lifetime, what happened in the United States. I mean, the fact that somebody like Trump can be elected. We shouldn't forget that he was really never elected by the majority of Americans, because still 3 million people, 3 million more Americans voted, not for him. Yet he still became the president.
Because of the system.
Because of the voting system. And that a man like that became president is bad enough. But the very fact that there is a chance that this man, who is insane, that he could probably become elected the second time, that idea really pisses you off.
We will see that this year. Okay, what happens after you die to you?
Nothing. I will be gone.
You will be gone.
I will. Sometimes I have problems getting to sleep. And when I have this problem, I feel, wouldn't it be nice when you die, you really find to sleep? Nothing will ever bother you again. It's gonna be the deep sleep.
Ultimate freedom.
No
stress about record industry.
And I don't think I will have any dreams, because the brain will definitely be gone by then. And yet it will be peace.
And that's very good. That's very good. I'm looking forward to that too. If your life would be a movie, I think it would be called The Guy Who Wanted to Start His Own Label.
That's right.
And you finally did in your 50s, and I'm so glad you did. Once again, thank you for your services for capturing the talent and making the Europe music life richer. So thank you for this talk and everything you've done.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks.